Look who's here. Hi, everyone. I'm Heather Moran. I'm the Executive Director of Sixth and I, and it is such a pleasure to welcome you here tonight. This building first opened in 1908. It was a synagogue for the first 45 years and an African Methodist Episcopal church for the next 50. And when the church relocated and put the building up for sale, the highest bid was from someone who wanted to turn it into a nightclub. But within 24 hours, 3 generous families intervened and bought the building with a vision for a renewed cultural and Jewish life in the heart of Washington, D.C. And now 13 years later, Sixth and I is a place for premium arts and culture, live entertainment, and timely conversations, as well as a synagogue that reimagines how religion and community can enhance our everyday lives. Now, partnership has been at the heart of our programming since our founding, and one of our longest running and most treasured partnerships has been with The Atlantic. Tonight's event is the latest installment in an ongoing series that brings The Atlantic's journalism to life on our stage through conversations with its leading editorial voices. Their impeccable journalism has continually elevated our programming, and we're so appreciative of the opportunity to be a platform for their critically important reporting. Tonight is the 5th time that Ta-Nehisi Coates has graced our stage. We are deeply honored to be a place that he returns to and look forward to more occasions for all of you to engage with his writing and ideas here. Now, this program sold out in less than 5 minutes. So if you know anyone who would have liked to be here, please tell them that it's being streamed live at facebook.com/The Atlantic, and they can tune in there. And as you're following along, please connect with us and The Atlantic on Twitter. I'm sure you can figure out what our handles are. And if you're a fan of our talks, check out our new podcast on iTunes, Sixth and I Live, which features recorded conversations with some of our recent guests, including Tim Ferriss, Esther Perel, and Van Jones. Now with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Jeffrey Goldberg. Jeffrey Goldberg is the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic and host of the super cool podcast, The Atlantic Interview. Jeffrey has been a generous friend to Sixth and I over the years, furthering this partnership, moderating events, and being an advocate for our work. So he deserves a very warm welcome, and please join me inviting Jeffrey Goldberg to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Heather. Thanks to everyone at Sixth and I for being such great partners to The Atlantic. I want to welcome you on behalf of The Atlantic to tonight's conversation with Ta-Nehisi Coates. The conversation tonight will be led by Alex Wagner, an Atlantic, that's Alex, an Atlantic contributing editor and one of my co-hosts on our other podcast, the Radio Atlantic podcast, also a hyper cool podcast. Alex, as most of you know, is a stellar broadcaster for CBS, and she has just joined Showtime's The Circus, though she actually does save her best work for us. Her forthcoming book, Future Face, examines fundamental questions about the American experience of race, immigration, exile, and identity through the prism of her own family history. Future Face will be out in April, and we are eager to welcome her back to this stage on April 18th. Before I turn this over to Alex, a brief word about The Atlantic and a brief word about the current dangerous moment in which we find ourselves. The Atlantic was founded in 1857 to argue for an end to slavery and to explicate and debate the American idea. It quickly became required reading for the political and intellectual elite of the North. In the spring of 1864, President Lincoln dispatched 2 emissaries on a quixotic mission to Richmond to sound out Jefferson Davis on the possibility of a compromise, a negotiated compromise to the Civil War. Upon their return, they told Lincoln that Davis was uninterested in any form of compromise whatsoever. Lincoln asked the men what they intended to do with their findings. They told him that they hoped to leak the story to a New York newspaper. Lincoln suggested instead that they write the definitive version of their ill-fated mission for The Atlantic. Such an article in The Atlantic, Lincoln said, could, quote, save me half a dozen battles. The Atlantic, throughout its history, has influenced the course of world events and has shaped American thought and policy. From Harriet Beecher Stowe and Ralph Waldo Emerson to John Muir, who invented the national park system in our pages, to Virginia Woolf, Mark Twain, and Hemingway, the Atlantic's writers have helped America understand itself. In 1901, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote prophetically in the Atlantic that, quote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." It was the problem of the 19th century as well, of course. In his 1866 Atlantic essay, Reconstruction, Frederick Douglass wrote, quote, "No republic is safe that tolerates a privileged class or denies to any of its citizens equal rights and equal means to maintain them." Just as the color line was the problem of the 19th and 20th centuries, so too is it a problem for the 21st. And no writer in America has done more to illuminate this problem than my friend and colleague Ta-Nehisi Coates. Through his essays and reporting for The Atlantic, Ta-Nehisi has done something exceedingly rare in the world today. He's actually changed people's minds. His latest piece for The Atlantic, The First White President, was a prescient exploration of the period of white backlash in which we live. Ta-Nehisi is among the finest writers working in English today, but his signal gift, in my opinion, is his dazzling skill as a reporter. In this debased moment, when the free press is under sustained assault from the President of the United States, it is the devotion of leading writers like Ta-Nehisi to stringently reported argument, to the ruthless interrogation of reality, to the unvarnished rendering of history, and most of all, to the sanctity of fact that keeps us away from the edge of the anti-democratic abyss. No writer has helped The Atlantic achieve its mission over the past decade more than Ta-Nehisi has. And I'm grateful for his writing, and I'm grateful for his friendship. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Alex Wagner and Ta-Nehisi Coates.
I think it only appropriate that we return the thank you to Jeff, who has also been an incredible friend and mentor. So big shout out to you, Jeff. Thank you for those kind words. And also for teeing up this debased moment that we are living in. Let me begin, my friend, with the news of the last few days, the news of today. I'll quote the President of the United States. Speaking of immigration, why are we having all these people from allegedly shithole countries come here? Why do we need more Haitians? Take them out. I want more Europeans. Why can't we have more immigrants from Norway? There are a few Republicans who have challenged the accuracy of that reporting, suggesting that the president did not say shithole, but shithouse. So let me just begin as a writer. Is there a substantive difference in your mind between shithouse and shithole?
No.
Okay, moving on. This is the first time, though, that the mainstream press has used the label racist in relation to the President of the United States. You have written extensively about the white nationalism that brought Trump to office. Why has it taken so long for him to be publicly labeled a racist?
Well, we live in a democracy. It's not an unproblematic democracy. It's not an uncompromised democracy. It's not certainly not a pure democracy. There are all sorts of issues around it, but there's a basic sort of agreement, even with the fact that Donald Trump did not win the majority of American votes. There's a basic notion that as the rules are set, as we determine the rules for a democracy, the president is an expression of the will of the people. The people are good. That's the idea. The American people, politicians say this over and over again. The American people are wise. The will of the American people. The American people know. It leads to very, very uncomfortable questions. If Donald Trump is a racist and the American people elected Donald Trump, what are the American people? It's hard for anybody to get in that mindset, because I think we all have a basic sort of fundamental democratic sensibility that most people, are good. And I agree that most people are good, but I think we may conflate most people are good with most people are wise, or most people are unprejudiced, or most people are not racist, or all the are not sexist, or all the other sort of sins that we all hold in our heart and tend to act on. The problem is that it's not just a condemnation of Trump. It is certainly at the very least a condemnation, or maybe not a condemnation. I shouldn't use that word. Maybe not a condemnation, but certainly it says something deeply unpleasant about a large percentage of American voters. I don't know if this has been brought back up, but it really should be. People really should revisit those deplorable comments by Hillary Clinton. Once again, who said, not that all Donald Trump, voters are, racist, bigoted, et cetera, but half of them, which would give you roughly, I don't know, about a quarter of the electorate or something like that. That always seemed about accurate to me.
But what surprises me about this moment in particular is that so many of Trump's supporters have come to his aid, have said, well, he's right. Look at those countries. Who wants to live there? They're all trying to come here. To the degree that one doesn't necessarily think they would adopt the mantle, proud racist, but they're certainly not doing anything to shrug it off.
Yeah, no, I mean, and again, I think this goes back to the question of democracy, because I would throw that back and say, why would they? Donald Trump is not out on a limb here. He is expressing beliefs and prejudices that are literally as old as this, older, in fact, not as old, older, as old as the presence of black people on the shores of North America is. This idea that, black people in any form are some sort of problem, that we don't want them. Well, we do kind of want them because we want to exploit them as much as possible. We want them to work for us. We want their music. We want them filling our jails, to provide jobs for people. But after that, they don't really have any use to us. That's a really, really old idea, And so, Trump is not particularly, he's expressing things that are regrettably at the core of the country, I'd argue.
Why do you think, Trump, in response to this moment, said, I am not racist. This is on Sunday to reporters. He said, I'm not racist. I am the least racist person you have ever interviewed, reporters. That I can tell you. He's also said that he's probably the least racist person on earth, as well as the least anti-Semitic person that you've ever seen in your entire life. He knows how this plays with his base. Who is the audience for those comments, do you think?
I mean, his base, other white racists. But again, I have to stress the continuity in Trump and past racists. Strom Thurmond, who starts the Dixiecrat Party, on a platform literally of segregation, and out-and-out white supremacist racist Nixon, in 1970, 71 says, Strom's not a racist. How can Strom Thurmond not be a racist? During this, on the onset of the Civil War, you can read, the letters from people who are at that very hour holding millions of people in bondage. And what do they fear? They fear the North making them into slaves. They're trying to make us into slaves, as they actually hold slaves. This sort of seemingly backward rhetoric where one does one thing and talks as though one is doing something else is not just, not particularly original to Trump. It's one of the main features of racism and white supremacy in this country. That there are moments in this country's history where people stand up and proudly say, yes, I'm a white supremacist, but those are moments when the term does not, when you don't have to deal with social censure around that term. The minute social censure kicks in, people change. They don't change how they're acting, but they change how they describe themselves and how they're willing to be described.
Paul Ryan called the president's comments unfortunate and unhelpful.
I'd agree with that.
At some point, if the Constitution is followed, Donald Trump will not be president of the United States. And some folks imagine that there will be a sort of reckoning or a paying of dues, balancing of the ledger. Do you think there is comeuppance in store for mainstream establishment political figures of the Republican Party who have abided by, and to some degree given cover to, the legacy and language of Donald Trump?
Probably not. And I suspect they know it, because if they didn't, they would act differently. I've gotten this, sort of reputation as this pessimist, so I hate saying things like this, but I can only be me. And in being me, I can only tell you that the, record, of this country, from the moment, black folks, got here, and I mean this well into modern times, in terms of people getting their comeuppance, when they, commit themselves, or not even commit themselves, but don't, particularly stand up, in moments when white supremacy or bigotry rears its head. There's not a long record of comeuppance when it comes to that. You are in a country right now where police execute black folks on the street, where cops, choked Eric Garner to death on camera. Where was the comeuppance? Why anyone would believe? Now, listen, if there is, I'm happy, if there is comeuppance, you know what I mean? I'd be very happy about that. But I don't think one should premise one's actions on that. I think you're really setting yourself up for disappointment. That just isn't the history. And again, it treats Trump and people who are allied with Trump as somehow separate, from the actual, problem. Trump became the main exigent for birtherism, but he didn't create the movement. He didn't create, a situation where you had majorities of the Republican Party believe in it. Something else happened before that, So, notion that these individual people are going to, get their just due, probably not.
I want to speak more about that contextualizing of Donald Trump's racial politics in the broader Republican narrative. You write in the essay, Donald Trump is the first white president, which also forms the epilogue to this fantastic book. You write that Trump's attack on Obama's legacy, that's healthcare, climate accords, and justice reform, was and is part of reifying white supremacy. So, do you feel like that extends broadly to the Republican policy and legislative platform? Is that embedded? Talk more about that.
Yes, I do, and I don't mean in the literal sense that say like Paul Ryan is a racist or something like that. Barack Obama came to office expecting to have equal partners. He had been in the Senate and he had worked with Dick Lugar, and there were these nice Republicans who were nice to him, and he said, "Yeah, I know these guys. We can we can cut deals." And one of the things that he did not understand was there are a lot of people here tonight who the image of Barack Obama as president of the United States filled you guys with joy. And you cried, and you were happy, and you were proud. I was too. I'm not, mocking you. I felt the same way. It was a big moment. What was not counted on, even by me, and I'll talk about this in the book, is that there were many, I won't say more, there were a number of Americans who saw that very same imagery and felt a very different way about it. That accords with history. That, makes sense. If you believe that white supremacy has been a particularly strong strain in American history and in American thought and in American politics, then it makes sense that there would be a not so small, group of, white voters out there who would feel differently about the election of a black president. Again, we live in a democracy. Republican politicians have to answer to those people. The modern Republican Party, largely, in its base, is formed out of a rejection of the civil rights movement, the Southern Strike. Everybody knows this. These people are not, and by which these people I mean the congressmen, the senators. It's not that they're bad people or individual racists or look at Paul Ryan and feel some type of way. John Boehner's daughter married a black dude with dreadlocks. I think.
Yes, she did. She sure did.
I mean, and from all I can tell, John Boehner's fine with that. But the people John Boehner serves. I think about like George Wallace. People consider Wallace like the boogeyman of white supremacy and racism and the civil rights. Folks don't know is he started off as a very, very progressive politician in Alabama. The NAACP liked him a lot. This is in all the histories. And he ran, and I can't remember the guy he ran against, but he lost. I think his name was Patterson. He loses. And he says, excuse my language, to one of his aides, "I'll never be out-niggered again." And he said, when he was reflecting on this, he said, "Listen, I used to go around the country talking about education, talking about schools, and people would just kind of nod off. But when I said nigga, 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 they stomped the floor." So it's comforting to believe that this is like in the hands of a few politicians. What's much more discomforting is that there's a democratic character to white supremacy. There's a democratic character to racism, that it is a part of identity in this country, and not just a matter of, say, Paul Ryan doing the right thing. There's a strong argument that if Paul Ryan did the right thing, Paul Ryan wouldn't have a job. Now that, is not to excuse Paul Ryan or excuse any other, Republican politician, but people are elected to do a job. So you have to ask questions about the people doing the electing and ask what they want.
Do you think they see that, these politicians, that they consciously understand where this is coming from?
I am extending perhaps too much of the benefit of the doubt, but you have to know that, like, birtherism is racist. Like, I just assumed you know that.
I guess birtherism, because
and I don't mean you, excuse me.
Yes.
But like, if you're like,
I do.
Right. I assume that, like, it, and that
you point out. I mean, you draw the line to things like repealing the Paris Climate Accords. Right. One could probably extend it to tax reform, which disproportionately favors the ultra-wealthy who are disproportionately white.
Right.
Do you think that in the back of in one's lizard brain, in the reptile part of the brain that we all have, that some of these legislators that have supported this policy understand the racial underpinnings?
I think what they understand, I don't know this, I haven't spent my time interviewing them, so I want to be careful here, but I think what they understand is they have an agenda, and they might not particularly have racist reasons for having that agenda. They might, legitimately believe we need to get out the Paris Climate Accords. But if I don't say it alloyed with certain other things, people might not choose that option. In other words, I think they know what moves people. People forget this. Mitt Romney is now seen as, responsible Republican, et cetera. They forget Mitt Romney made a birther joke. They forget about Newt Gingrich, going up and talking about how Barack Obama was the food stamp president. Why did he do that? Is that just, Newt Gingrich? Is that just him? Or is there, something else that he's speaking to, in a particular way? George H.W. Bush, seen as a model of, responsible Republican. What was Willie Horton? What was that? What was he doing? And so it's not even so much that I think these people have a particular animus towards black people, although there's, probably some of that too. But I don't think that's the biggest factor. I think it's knowledge. It was clear during Obama's that if you stood up, if too many people stood up and directly said, listen, this birtherism is absolute nonsense, that there was a price to be paid for doing that. So people cowered, didn't do it. And made way for Donald Trump, by the way, in not doing that.
He is the full expression
That's
of that.
Right.
You also write, to accept that whiteness brought us Donald Trump is to accept whiteness as an existential danger to the country and the world. Do you think Americans realize that right now?
No. I think there's a significant number of Americans who are beginning to realize that, yes, he is an existential danger to the country and the world. Again, I've said this over and over again. I'll say it again. When you have a guy conducting foreign policy and negotiations with a nuclear power via Twitter, you're in trouble. You're in trouble. And that sounds, funny or however I say, but that's an accurate description of what's happening. You have a guy who, can't read the intelligence reports because it's too much text and too many. Listen, just think about, like, in your own life, right? Would you hire an accountant that was like, these tax things, they just totally bore me. Can I get more charts, please? Would you hire that person to take care of your financial welfare? And if you did, somebody might say, your finances, this person is an existential danger to your finances. That's a pretty, accurate summation that you might make. If you needed, if you were in need of, a security guard or something like that, do you hire somebody and say, I don't, I just want to sit in this rocking chair and go to sleep, drink my Diet Coke and watch, Fox and Friends? You wouldn't hire that person. Your life might be in danger. Your existential existence might be in danger if you did that. And so I think there's probably a growing realization of that. Connecting it back to the whiteness piece is probably too much to ask, even though I'm asking.
settle for existential danger at this
Yeah. Well, I won't settle, but I understand. Listen, you have to be somewhat sympathetic here. When people are enrolled in something, as all white people are in, whiteness, it's very hard to see your contribution because it's not just an indictment of Donald Trump. On some level, you become a part of it. And then the question becomes, what are you going to do about it? It's not enough to just be passive. It becomes your burden, and people with power, it's nothing, particular, about, white people. Nothing white about, whiteness, or nothing white about white supremacy, by which I mean there's nothing about having blonde hair or blue eyes that makes you act a certain way. People with power generally don't want to acknowledge it. They don't want to acknowledge how it privileges them. I mean, that's period. And when it, becomes a danger to themselves and other people, they tend to be very slow about recognizing it.
You talk about white folks or Americans that look at Donald Trump as an existential threat and ask the question, what do we do about it? Oprah Winfrey made a speech at the Golden Globe Awards when she was being awarded the Cecil B. DeMille Award. And among the topics she addressed, race, civil rights, gender, inequality, being a young black girl growing up in this country. What did you make of that speech?
I thought it was a good speech. I thought it was a good speech, and I thought it was an important speech. I thought it was a historic moment. I thought she was dead on about being conscious of, young black girls who were at home watching her at that particular moment. This was something that, could not happen when I was a child. So I thought it was a really, really important speech. I was somewhat disenchanted, not with her speech, but by the move from her speech to she should run for president.
Why was that?
I think we're grasping for anything that's anti-Trump, man. Anything. And that's not a condemnation of Oprah so much as it is a condemnation of our desperation. There was a great piece that argued that Oprah should run for governor. And I thought that made, the point. Politics is a real thing. It's an actual craft, just like, television and broadcast journalism is an actual craft that she's practiced. Acting is an actual craft that, she's practiced. And so I don't think the answer to Trump is to get another Trump. Oprah would obviously be much more compassionate, much more intelligent. My son would be much more compassionate, much more intelligent. My wife would. I mean, anybody in this audience, would be. But I just wonder what we're asking for here.
Well,
I
guess I'm like on two minds of it. One, it's what do you make of the country that on one hand follows up the election of a reality TV star with the potential nomination of a talk show host? And then, on the other hand, what do you make of a country that elects its first black president and then 4 years later contemplates the election of its first black female
that's the
president?
other thing, man. It's like, listen, man, y'all always asking us to come clean up your shit. I mean, this is like come on. Do it yourself for once. White people gave us Donald Trump, and I mean that in the most specific, way. I argue, and I don't mean that as a broad sort of rhetorical condemnation. No, I mean that by the numbers. Like, Donald Trump won virtually every white demographic. White women, white men, poor white people, rich white people, working class white people with college education, white people, just, go down. He won them all. He won them all. Don't be looking to Oprah. I mean,
Did you see
Wait, no, because hold on, Alex, because this is important. You think about all the things they said about Barack and all the mess he had to deal with. What are they going to say about Oprah? Why should she take that? For what? Why should she stand up and listen to these folks' mammy jokes and all the horrible, horrible things they're going to say about her and her family? This is a black woman, who has lived on her own individual terms. We learned a lot in this Me Too moment about how folks, that was what her speech was about how, women who live like that and how they're viewed and the threat of that sort of independence. She does not have children. Nothing wrong with that. But my God, what they would do with that. And I just wouldn't wish that on anybody. Folks need to deal with that themselves. You know what I mean? Don't put that, on her to, carry. You know what I mean? To deal with your sins.
I want to talk a little. You bring up the Me Too movement. In the same essay, you touch on white supremacy and sort of sexual undercurrent. White supremacy has always had a perverse sexual tint. Trump's rise was shepherded by Steve Bannon, a man who mocks his white male critics as cucks. What do you make of the intersection of the two right now? Because a lot of people see an inextricable link between the sort of reckoning that's happening as far as sexual predation and harassment and the rise of Donald Trump and his strain of what you call white nationalism, white supremacy.
Yeah, I mean, there was always a gender component to actually how racism and white supremacy was practiced. This is not, my insight. The great historian Nell Payne has been, so crucial to me and my understanding of things, regarding race and gender. But, mainly, race with her great book, History of White People. But I was talking to her about Trump when I was working on that essay, man, and I was, trying to get at this working class piece. Lynching, and the cry of, rape in white women is actually not a really common occurrence during slavery. And if you think about it, you'll immediately understand why. You can't, black people, when they were owned, when they were enslaved, were generally the most valuable piece of property that anybody would own. It was like owning a house. You just don't have the luxury of lynching black people under those conditions because they, are property. Lynching begins immediately after, and one of the things that basically happens is, what is the common piece of property that white men can now point to? Well, their wives. That becomes, a much easier, proposition to make. And so these things have always been adjacent. But for me, specifically, this has been a moment of education, not simply on understanding how pervasive sexual harassment is, not merely on understanding how pervasive rape and sexual assault is. It has given me great sympathy that maybe I did not have for some of my white readers. And here's why. You can live your life in such a way and read and get so lost in the reading and the research and the knowledge of facts and just living your life that you think that any person should really know. Things become immediately obvious to you. And what you can forget is one of the functions of power when it's trying to protect yourself is that it blinds people. It really does. So folks will come up to me after the case for reparations. They say, "Oh, well, I didn't know that at all. I had no idea about redlining a house." And I would say, how could you not know? How could you not know? I mean, you're literally living in the neighborhoods. Well, here I am, a black man, living here in America, and I got to tell you, I don't read no stories like, my God, I did not know. I did not know. I was, just as blind and just as blinded as people who I assumed. And it's not like I didn't know, if you had said, Ta-Nehisi, do you think, sexual assault, is a huge problem in this country? Do you think sexual harassment is a big problem in the workplace in this country? I would have nodded and said, yeah. You know what I mean? Just like a lot of my readers, if you said, you think racism is a big problem, no, I said, yeah. You know what I mean? It's not the same as seeing it played out. Do you understand? It's not like when you see it point by point, in a New York Times article laid out in that, you have no idea what it means to have, somebody scrutinize how you're dressing every day. You can't go to the office party because you're scared some dude is going to stick his tongue down your throat. I mean, just a whole range of liberties that I basically take for granted in my life are not granted to an entire another class of people. That should be familiar to me. I can't say it was. I just can't, And so when I talk about, privileges and when I talk about power, especially right now, I'm reflecting, on myself, because the fact of the matter is, to again concede it's this bad indicts you. Indicts you because you're privileged by it. Do you understand? You get something out of it. Even if you've never done X, Y, and Z, you are still getting something out of it. You have certain privileges. You have, safety and things you don't have to worry about. I'm sorry, I'm going off on this a little bit. I'm going to stop. I think about, being, 24 when I first moved to New York, and how I would do dumb things like go out to a bar, get drunk and, fall asleep on the subway and come home.
Haven't we all?
Well, I think I had a presumption of safety that I might not have had if I was somebody else. Yeah. That's what I'm saying. You know, I think, I presume that certain dudes weren't going to do, they might do one thing to me, but there was a whole class of things that they might not do to me. And that was, in my mind. And so you think about all the things. I mean, I just think about like the struggle I went through in this book about being a writer, right? And how difficult it was to get people to take my pitches seriously. And then I'm trying to pitch some editor, and this is the sort of thing that happened. It happened. Somebody tells me, okay, you can have this story, but you got to blow me first? I mean, that's not my world. That's not something I had to deal with. You know what I mean?
It sort of feels like it's the best of times and the worst of times when it comes to race and gender in the United States right now. Because there is an open conversation about racism, there's an open conversation about gender and power and harassment. Is there something energizing in that?
Not particularly for me. I mean, you had, like, as a journalist, like, you guys should, like, have some historians up here. Y'all think I'm pessimistic. I'm not. I assure you I'm not. Like, because the thing is, what you immediately remember is that this has happened before. This is not an original moment. And then you remember everything that happened afterwards. You read some history post-Civil War on just how open that moment was early in Reconstruction. You read about how, at one point, Grant was so empowered, and so, filled with feeling, in terms of, equality. He actually defeated the first incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan, and it wasn't enough. It just wasn't enough. People, were open for a few years, but they got lazy and decided that they wanted, their country back. And then, you had, effectively another 100 years of terrorism and black people in the South not being able to vote. It goes away so quickly. And so easily. You think about the energy during the Civil Rights Movement, and how easily that gave way, to Nixon. So, you think about Black Lives Matter, for all of the protesting they're doing in the streets, and cops are still getting off with shooting people down. So, what am I supposed to say? That's the record.
Let's talk about how the battle is unfolding, though, because Caitlin Flanagan has written a piece for The Atlantic that's gotten a lot of pickup. It's in the wake of an article that came out about Aziz Ansari that has been hotly debated on various corners of the internet about whether the story told about him constitutes sexual harassment. Caitlin Flanagan writes, "I thought it would take a little longer for the hit squad of privileged young white women to open fire on brown-skinned men. I had assumed that on the basis of intersectionality and all that they'd stayed laser-focused on college-educated white men for another few months. But we're at warp speed now, and the revolution, in many ways so good and so important, is starting to sweep up all sorts of people into its conflagration, the monstrous, the cruel, and the simply unlucky." I want to ask your thoughts on that idea of the hit squad staying laser-focused on one group as opposed to another.
Well, that's a lot.
Sorry.
What I'll say is I don't want to say too much about Aziz Ansari and this piece. And it's not because I have anything particular to hide. But going back to what I said earlier about, like reading those stories, like, wow, I didn't know. Part of this is that, well, let me answer first. Let me just give a, okay. I don't think Aziz Ansari was targeted because he was brown. And I think, like, Russell Simmons came up before this. And I think Tavis Smiley came up, before this. And Russell Simmons being, one of the, at least in my world, one of the more, famous folks. I think Bill Cosby, you can argue that a lot of this started actually with Bill Cosby, that he was the first big. Yeah. So I don't think that's a correct, just from, the basics of facts. I don't think that's actually a correct analysis of what happened. But having said that, again, analogizing myself to, some of my white readers, it can be irritating for someone, no matter how smart they are, no matter how smart they think they are, who has just become aware of a problem to begin publicly diagnosing that problem. I think there are people who have thought about this a lot longer than me. I think there are people who have been aware of this a lot longer than me. I don't want to put my opinion next to theirs. Because I have like my reaction. I got my reactions. I mean, I'm human. I have reactions to that story. I have my reactions that I would, say to my wife over coffee. I got reactions that I would say to some friends after my second beer. But that's not an informed opinion. And one should not, mistake, one, for the other. So I don't want.
It's very judicious of you, perhaps born of the fact that you are no longer on Twitter.
Yeah, it is.
Which is
it
the
is.
forum for uninformed opinions.
No, I mean, the one thing that Caitlin does say, the one thing that is true in that, the speed at which, and when you're out of it, you can really see it. The speed at which, people are certain, about what happened is interesting. There are writers who I am dying to read on this, and it's so interesting to me that they have not written yet. And I mean writers who write about this. And it's very interesting to me that they have not written yet. And I think that's a statement.
Let's talk a little bit about this exit from Twitter. Cornel West, in a piece for The Guardian, accused you of fetishizing white supremacy. In the wake of that, you decided to get off the Twitter machine. Tell us a little bit about that decision-making process.
Well, it wasn't an accusation. I mean, I've been, worse has been said about me than that. So that wasn't that bad. I mean, I guess I should just give the full context of the Cornell thing. We did an event earlier today, so I'm like trying not to repeat myself, but I guess
no one was there for
no one was there.
For that,
but
except
there's
for me
video
and Jeff
of it, so
Goldberg.
people are gonna see both.
Okay, that's true. People do look for video clips of you on the internet, but
I was a student here at Howard University, and Cornel West came here, I think, in '97, maybe, with Henry Louis Gates for a book he was promoting, and I had never seen a public performance like that at all. I mean, it was incredible. It was absolutely, absolutely incredible. I had not seen a human being, and for me, because of who I was, a black man's mind move that quickly. He could, as I was saying earlier, draw these connections between, hip hop, Kierkegaard, and Coltrane, and, other people that I had never heard of. And he could pull it together in this coherent kind of way, you know what I mean? And so it was deeply, deeply impressive, and it just, gave you some notion of, like what's actually possible, So I think one more time after that, while I was, a student, so I had him at this place, in my head, and Between the World and Me came out, and I got this beautiful, beautiful blurb from Toni Morrison, and I was, really, really proud of, and I get this tweet, people like, Cornell going after you, man, what you gonna do, what you gonna do? And that's really half the problem, right? Cornell, what you gonna do? What you gonna do? This is, so much of, I just bracket this off. So much of this is like being a kid and in middle school. And people hyping stuff up. So much of it. And it ain't that the other kid ain't did nothing. I'm not trying to, make them innocent. But so much of it is that the hyping of it up, except the hyping is being done by the New York Times and Vox all of a sudden. But that's what it's like, you know what I mean? And so, piece comes out, book comes out, Cornel West writes something, on Facebook. You can Google it, you can see it yourself, about how, Ta-Nehisi Coates ain't the next James Baldwin because he don't do this, he don't do that, and it was clear from the piece that, he had just heard of me like a couple days earlier. Which was weird because I had interviewed him like a year earlier and quoted him in a piece about drones, which he said I never talked about anyway. So they was like that, right? And I was like, damn, okay, all right, cool. Then he wrote another follow-up to that Facebook post. This is the second one. He wrote again, my comments shouldn't be misunderstood, Coach, that. Okay, all right, cool. Between the World and Me, everything happens, with that book. I pick up New York Times magazine, and it's like, and actually I got a note from somebody actually before. It's like, Cornell going after you, man. What you gonna do? What you gonna do? You know what I'm saying? I opened the New York Times magazine. He's like, you got to be tackling white supremacy. And Coates doesn't, his wee wages about that. And I'm like, you know what I'm saying? It's like, yo, it's the second page, B. It's the second page. All of it, is right there. So it's like, he ain't read the book, right? Okay, all right, cool. Then a week later, I get another, yo, Cornell going at you, man, what you going? And I see this piece in The Guardian, right? And it's all the things, coats don't talk about this, coats don't talk about that, coats don't. And some of them I don't talk about, right? I got this whole thing where you should, it's just like the Me Too joint. You know, you need to be informed when you're talking. You know what I mean? Because people take your words seriously, and unless you are equipped to intellectually defend them, you know, you need to shut up and have a seat. You know, it don't mean, you know, I mean, I, you know, don't have, you know, my own theories about, you know, Morgan Stanley and, you know, late capitalism and, you know, billionaires and all of that stuff. You know what I mean? But that's like, oh, that's that coffee conversation. That's that, you know, we having a beer conversation. That's not where, you know, my reporting strengths, and, you know, by strengths in terms of like my time spent reporting, it don't lie there. That ain't, you know, really, you know, who I am. And so, all these things, but then it was like 90% of the things I actually had talked about. It was like 10%. So I was like, all right, I'm gonna, you know, just naively. When you are a kid like me and grows up like I do, your highest ambition is not to fight Cornel West. It just isn't. I mean, that's not what you're imagining. That's not. I know there's like this whole thing, and people did this, you know, in the subsequent articles, this tradition of, you know, black intellectuals. B, I ain't come for that. I know exactly what I came for. And it wasn't that. I know exactly who I'm taking shots at. I know exactly who I'm aiming at, and it ain't Cornel West. You know, and so, you know, I know, you know, who I want and what I want. So it's like, I don't want to do this. But, you know, at the same time, some folks ain't going to read the book. You know, some folks ain't going to go through my blog, you know, my blogs. I need to be clear about what I've written and that. So I tweet that out. I should not have done that. That was a huge mistake. Because what I did was I added fuel to the fire. And I made, you know, what was not a feud as far as I'm concerned, appeared to be, it gave enough evidence for people who really wanted to say it was one. And it just blew up everywhere, man. It just blew up everywhere. And the thing that got me was like, you know, I'm looking at my mentors and I'm getting like, literally like every 5 seconds, and people got like Twitter threads about this. You know, and I think like, and I want to be, you know, really clear about what I'm about to say. This is not, you know, a slam at a particular ideology, but the moment that really got me, it actually wasn't the Richard Spencer thing, which was bad. But the moment that I was like, I clearly don't belong here is I got a tweet, and it was like, here are all the black women who critiqued Ta-Nehisi who have been ignored. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, this is something else now. Like, people are, you know, showing out their bona fides. You know, people are like, you know, competing, you know, with each other. And at that point, I was like, yo, I'm in the wrong room. I'm clearly in the, like, I didn't come for this. This is not, you know, what, you know, my writing, you know, and my work, and what I don't want my life to be about this. I don't want Ta-Nehisi fought Cornel West anywhere in my obituary. Anywhere. Like, I just don't, that's not, and I have no control over that, but I just don't, I don't want any part of that. And, you know, like, for me, you know, especially after, you know, coming off Between the World and Me in this book, it was like, you know, when I was a kid, I was like you know, always like a pretty big kid, right? Never liked to fight. You know what I'm saying? I didn't want to get hit, but I also didn't want to, you know, really hit anybody. That wasn't really my spirit. But when you're a big kid, like, smaller kids pick with you because they want to make a rep, right? And everybody in the classroom cheers it on. What you gonna do? What you gonna do? Well, you can't win in that situation, right? Because if I kick this kid's ass, well, he ain't had nothing to lose anyway, right? But if I don't kick his ass, I'm a punk. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's really no win, except the fact that when you're an adult, you can walk out the room. You can lead a class because you're an adult, and you can conduct yourself, you know, in that fashion. And that's, you know, what it felt like. It was disconcerting to watch the New York Times, and not just the New York Times, I'm picking on them because that's where it started, provide an open market, you know, for this sort of thing. To then write articles about the thing that they had basically helped create. You know, and then when I complained about it, the response is, well, why don't you write a letter so that they can eat more? It was like watching people eat off of this. I mean, that was like the thing that people will actually eat off you, that they want a feud because it's good for them, it's good for business, and if I'm being real, it may even be good for the person attacking you. And so what you got to figure out is how you going to navigate that. I'm new to this. You know what I mean? 2-3 years ago, it was like a handful of people who knew who I was. And you get a platform and you get power, and it is very difficult to figure out how to be responsible with that power. Listen, I'm going to say just like I said in the earlier event, and I mean this, man. I really, really mean this. This is not, an attempt to play nice. I really do. I wish Cornel West the best. I wish him the best. It's the 25th anniversary of Race Matters. It's a really, really important book. I'm assuming almost everybody in this audience, because you're here, has read it and has it. If it's like 2 or 3 of y'all, that have not, you should go out and get it. We need more black voices, not less. I have never asked to be the one Negro interpreter. I don't want any part of that. So to the extent that, folks can recognize and recall how important that book was then and how important it is now, I support it.
I'll venture out on a limb and say that was a very adult response.
It's true. It's true.
But I do want to talk about Black intellectualism, and I also want to talk about this book that is out now. One of the things what I love about the book is not just that it's a compendium of your great writing for The Atlantic, but that you contextualize each piece with a sort of like updated intro. And in one of them you write that you believe that President Obama was directly responsible for the crop of young black writers and thinkers that sort of came to prominence during his 8-year term. You also write that you think black writers are necessarily dyspeptic and necessarily resistant. What do you think Donald Trump and this current moment in American politics is doing for black intellectual life?
Wow, a lot. A ton. I mean, and that's a great question. I hadn't even thought about that. That's a lot. A lot. I mean, in many ways, weirdly enough, he is the continuation of, the kind of market that Barack Obama established. Whereas Barack Obama obviously did it in a kind of positive way. This is being done in a totally different way, but I mean, a lot. I think the one difference probably though is the President Trump has forced more white writers to go in that space also. So yeah, I mean, and I think it's important to be conscious of that, because in my mind there will come a period, probably in the probably relatively soon, where folks will not be this interested in race and in black folks and that sort of thing. I think we're in a particular moment. I don't assume at that moment will continue beyond the Trump presidency.
What do you think is the greatest structural hurdle to making journalism less white?
Wealth, basic family wealth. I think that's there is a I say this all the time, and it might have changed since then, but when I was doing the case for reparations, this is basically it. There was a 1 to 20 wealth gap between black families and white families. For every nickel of black wealth, there was $1 of white wealth. Journalism, at least when I was trying to get into it, and the kind of journalism that I do, was ridiculously hard to get into, because one of the primary ways people would do it is they would take internships at the New York or wherever, some magazine in New York, and they wouldn't get paid. How many kids can do that? Now, very few Americans can do that, period. But certainly very few black Americans, or Americans of really any stripe, brown or whatever, can do that. It takes a tremendous amount of, actual investment. I got here, largely because of, the investment of my dad. I mean, literally, like when I first started my blog, literally giving me money, actually. The investment, of my wife, who worked a jobs plural, that she did not, particularly love, and only asked of me that I write harder, today than I had yesterday. The only thing she ever asked. Never said, why don't you go back to, get your degree and become a lawyer. She said, no, this is it, baby. What you need to do is you need to write harder. That's it. I was deeply fortunate. Very few people find that in their relationships. That is not the norm. You know what I'm saying? That's just not the norm. And so I am the product of, I think a unique amount of investment. Other people don't need that investment because the family already got it,
You bring up your wife, and you write about her in the book. You talk about your wife more than most men talk about their wives, and certainly most writers. You write about Kenyatta in the book, about how you have wanted to support her, and I love this sentence, make real her marriage of mission and dream. And you write, as she changes her career path, I had not been prepared for the simple charm of watching someone you love grow. People, when they think and talk about writers, tend to think of them as selfish or lonesome or lonely or just happier by themselves. That is not the case with you. You have a partnership that very much seems to be a partnership of equals, that is mutually nurturing, and where the bond seems to have grown over time instead of lessened. Can you talk a little bit about how you've made that happen? What you asking for a friend? How do you? But truly, I mean, can you tell us a little bit about that partnership, because it seems so foundational to your success?
I mean, I can. I'm hesitant to give advice though, because I think like it was like really, each person is that individual person. And so the calculus that was made, the decisions that were made in our relationship, I think were particular to us. There was at least some notion of gender equality. I mean, it was obviously a huge one on her part, but there was some, the book that actually got us together, this is a book by Paula Giddings called When and Where I Enter. And I read it, and I didn't read it out of any particular wokeness around gender. I just kind of, I would just like that time, I just kind of stumbled into it. I was like a 19-year-old kid. But I love that book. It's Paula Giddings is a great, great historian. And Kenyatta had read that book. So we kind of started there. You know what I mean? Like, this is like when we're kids in college and everything. I think, and again, I wouldn't advise any of this, y'all. I'm just telling you I can only tell you what happened. I can't tell you what to do. So, especially from what I'm about to say, parents who have, kids in their, in their early 20s, what I'm about to say here. I think a crucial part was having a child very young. Again, I don't advise that necessarily.
How old were you, for people who don't know?
Oh, Lord, I was 24. I was 23. And we had both dropped out of college. So it was not ideal, if you, mapped it out on paper.
Sure.
But you know what? The thing was, we, like all couples, we argue about, different things, but the fate, like basic stuff like religion in terms of the kid, school, like we didn't have arguments about that. We really did not have arguments about the kid and what, was supposed to happen. So we had a pretty good foundation in that. We did not marry until, much later, actually. But I always felt like, and this is just me, again, I'm not giving advice here, I felt like, and I'm pretty sure she felt like, the kid was a stronger bond in any ring. Because we both knew and felt that he would be better off if we were both there. And so if we did not get it worked out, ultimately he could pay a price for it. And so we didn't want any part of that. Like, we just didn't, neither one of us really wanted. So whatever difficulty, that was always like there in the back of our mind. We got blessed with a really beautiful, wonderful, understanding, calm kid, you know what I mean, who was just really easy. And so, I think that was a factor. I think Kenyatta is she's just a uniquely giving person. People, it's not particular women, people do not necessarily look at, college dropouts who are on unemployment, who have lost 3 straight jobs, and say, you should write more. That's not, and I forgive you if that's not your answer. There's nothing wrong with that not being your answer. But that was not, her response. And so I think it was that. I think despite having a kid, we always had this kind of like ambition. So we moved in New York when Samari was like 1 year old. We didn't have no money. But we moved anyway because, if, at that point she wanted to be in magazines as an editor, which she ultimately did, and I wanted to be a writer. And if we were going to do it, you had to go. There was no 2 ways around that. You just had to find your way, to do it. after I was, gotten, basically fired from Time Magazine or laid off or whatever, and it was just making my way with the Atlantic, and she was pretty much done. She wanted to go back to school and become a doctor. And, I said, all right, well, we got to figure out how to do it. You got to do it. My dad used to, he always, told me, like, you got to name the dream first and then figure out the money later. But name the dream first. Don't, get the money and then say, here's what I'm going to do. Say, here's what I'm going to do, and then go find the money. You know what I mean? And so that was, like, very much, our approach. So, she went to Columbia, went, got her pre-med, stuff done, came back down here to Howard. She's in her second year right now, doing, really well. I'm proud as hell of her. But for me, it was like that part about support, like it wasn't even a male macho thing. I wanted to give back. You know what I mean? I wanted to express my gratitude. You know what I mean? That somebody would do that. The last part of this, and this is recent, my dearly departed David Carr, he used to say, life is scary, best to hold hands. He's talking about marriage. Life is scary, best to hold hands. Tell you something, past 2 years for me have been really scary. The things people offer you when you achieve a measure of fame, the things people get offended by when you achieve a measure of fame, the whole way people approach you, your relationships, your how, and I'm saying this as a male heterosexual, your relationships, like how you think your interactions with women are, all of that changes. And I needed stability in that. I needed things that were true. I actually am a little bit lonely, and I'm not lonely, a little bit lonesome, or however you want to call it. I got a small circle. And the thing that was true was Samari and Kenyatta. That was true. That was true. You know what I mean? Whatever else was happening, I can't get this figured out. Well, this I can get figured out. This I understand to be true. And it was true when I was a failing, writer who could not, get a job, who couldn't work at the failing New York Times.
Is that paper still around?
Right. And then when it was still true, you know what I mean? When I got to MacArthur, that was always true. And I need true things, like in my life. I gotta have a thing that I can come back to, no matter what's going on out here. This is correct. It'll be here, when I'm on the New York Times bestseller list. It will be there, when I'm far gone from the New York Times bestseller list and trying to get Chris Jackson to publish my work. That'll always be true.
I'm gonna ask you one more question before we take a few questions from the audience. You write about Nas in your book.
Love Nas.
And don't we all? And a conclusion that his music led you to as it concerned your own writing. You write, art was not sentimental. It had no responsibility to be hopeful or optimistic or make anyone feel better about the world. I've wondered this about you because you decry sort of solutionism as a public intellectual, right? But I hear your story, and I hear just what you said about ambition, which at its core feels like there's optimism, right? Mm-hmm. Let's try it. Let's go. Let's move. Try this gig. Yeah. Do you find it hard not to offer something at these, especially to quote our fearless leader, Jeffrey Goldberg, in these debased times?
No, I find it...
I just ask this personally, not intellectually.
No, I don't. I mean, the only hard thing on me is I'm sorry people expect that of me. What is present in that notion of ambition is not so much optimism, but the fact that if you sit on your ass, it ain't gonna happen. That I know. Now, I don't know what happens once you get up, but I know if you sit, I do know what happens if you stay seated. I'm very, very clear, like I'm certain on that. Now, what happens after that? The world is chaotic. We'll see how the breaks go. But you got to get up if you want something. You know what I mean? And for me, this has always been, where I've been in terms of, activists and the black struggle. People say, well, how can you be, this way and still, connected to this black tradition of struggle? But I'm very connected to it because, listen, if I thought tomorrow that the world was, going over the cliff and it was the end of everything, I'd still fight. I'd still fight because what if it's not? What if it's not? There's always that chance. Even if I was 100% certain, I'd still fight. Because life ain't just about life. Life is about living. And how do I want to live? Well, I want to live in struggle. I don't care. I use the example in the book of like, Nat Turner. There's no chance Nat Turner is going to be successful. You know what I mean? You look at, African Americans resisting throughout history. Listen, most of the story is not Martin Luther King. It don't usually end in winning. And even when it does end in winning, it actually ends in them shooting you in the head. That's what happens. I'm not being flip. I'm being real about this. Most of the times, it don't break your way. So what am I to make of the mass of African American history that by the notion of hope, by the notion of, a demand for optimism, that today is the day, that in your lifetime, this thing will necessarily be solved. What do I make of the 350 years of enslaved generations of African Americans who resisted? With nothing in sight, who could look back and see their grandparents enslaved. Look back, I've said this before, their great-great-great-grandchildren enslaved. What were they fighting for? What were they struggling for? What was their struggle ultimately worth? If it did not, in that moment right there, or at all, contribute to the end of their oppression. And see, I believe in human dignity. I believe in that. I believe that you have, no matter what's going to, happen, you have the right to say, this is the way I want to live my life. This is the way I want to conduct my affairs, and the way I do not want to conduct my affairs, no matter what I think of Trump, no matter what I think of white people who are, and what they're ultimately going to do. I do not want to conduct my affairs by lying in bed and pulling covers over my eyes. That's not how I want to live. And so I can't control what most people in this country are going to do. I have no idea. But I got me. I can control me. I can talk about how I want to live, what I want to be a part of, what I want to encourage. And so I try to stay in that space. And, you never know what will happen. You might get a black president. You just don't know what's going to happen. You don't know.
You don't know. On that note, let's open it up to some questions. And please make sure they are questions, and we don't have a ton of time, so succinct is good. Gentleman at the microphone.
You just spoke about solutionism. First of all, thank you for being here. You're amazing. You're amazing. You spoke about solutionism, optimism, and you used the word hope, and you've written about President Obama, but 8 years gone. In this moment, what is your take on President Obama and his legacy? Thank you.
That's a big question.
Yep.
I think it's tremendously important. I think before we had an African American president, it was held up as tremendously important that we had never had one. It can't be true that it was important when we didn't have one, and it was thus unimportant when we got one. I think that we are often dismissive of symbols. And I think we think like symbols don't matter. But, I grew up in a time where you didn't see black people, and I see interracial couples in advertisements now. That is mind-blowing. And I remember when that didn't happen. Like, I remember that world. I see black women with natural hair in advertisements now. Like, on TV, like it's okay. And I remember when the message was, it's not okay. So, you have to believe, I have to believe, you don't have to do anything. I have to believe that if you're a young kid and your first memory of the first family is, Barack Obama, and his, ferocious, beautiful, intelligent wife, and his ferocious, beautiful, intelligent, daughters, like that has some impact. That says something about the humanity and the fitness of black people, for citizenship in this country. There's a lot I don't like about his legacy. I hated how, he talked to, in some ways, black people in general. I specifically hated how, shouldn't use the word hate, did not like, how he addressed poor black people, how he addressed black boys, black men. I was really upset by his Morehouse speech. To watch those, and a lot of people that would disagree with me on this, but to watch those young men who had walked through fire, to get their, degrees, to be, hectored in that way, it just bothered the hell out of me, But I think overall, especially by the standards of what's going on now. But even if it was not the standards, I think it was good. I think it was good. I think it was not perfect, but I think it was good.
Thank you.
Over here.
One of my favorite lines from your book was when somebody asked you, why do white people like reading you? And your question was, how do you defy a power that insists on claiming you? Because I think it kind of emulates what a lot of people of color go through, right? If you get your degree and you get your good job and you have your family and you have no record, right, all of a sudden, right, you're the poster child for picking yourself up by your bootstraps, especially if your parents never went to college or whatever.
Right.
And so in reading your book and thinking about that line, and I think about it a lot, I was talking to some of my white friends on how it feels sometimes like it's a catch-22, right? You can get your degree, but if you're being yelled at some store, right, by some white woman and her daughter, you're not actually allowed to respond, because then all of a sudden, right, you're outside that box that they've put you in. And so they were like, well, how do we make sure that doesn't happen? And I was like, I don't know. I don't know if you can actually do it. But I was like, I'm going to this talk, and I'm going to see. So I'm just hoping you give me an answer to give to them about how white people can stop putting people of color into this catch-22 scenario.
Yeah, no, it's like what you should do as a black person in that moment?
No, what white people can do to ensure that people of color don't feel like they always have to act in a certain level of whiteness in order to be accepted, in order for it to be okay.
Maybe just what is the advice to give to white people about avoiding making people of color into avatars?
Yeah, or that.
I mean, it helped that no more people of color. It is natural, I think, when you only see singular representatives of people to then ascribe the attributes of that single person to, all of those other people. So this person did X, Y, and Z and pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. Why can't you? It's one of the things I got, where I get, after my own success. Well, you're successful. White people come listen to you. Therefore, that must be evidence that there is no racism. That has to be what it is. Of course, absent from that is, any sort of work that you did yourself. It's the same with Barack Obama. I mean, it was like, we elected a black president. Doesn't this necessarily mean, X, Y, and Z about white supremacy? No, it actually doesn't, because it could just be true that he worked, 100 times, as hard as everybody else. I mean, that could also, be the case. I don't know what to tell white people to not do that, because I think if you're doing that, there are probably 5 other things wrong before that. Like that assumes a kind of goodwill, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but it assumes a kind of goodwill that I suspect probably is not there. If you're making, that sort of, in other words, that kind of ignorance is built on 5 other ignorances, if that makes sense. So it might be that by the time you get somebody talking to you like that, it's probably too late. It's probably, and I don't mean too late for you, but it's like we're like you got to have a basis to begin, the conversation. So where do you begin? It's one of the things I think about, like with Twitter, like there's this notion that we can talk ourselves out of everything. I just give you X, Y, and Z information that will make everything okay, but information is actually built on other information and other assumptions. It's always like that. For instance, you have to really believe that black people are equal to you. You have to believe that. You should not take it for granted that that's a belief. And so I don't know that those prerequisites have always been filled.
That's fair. Thank you.
We just have time
do.
for 2 or 3 more questions, so I apologize to you guys in the back of the line. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Whitney. I'm going to be quick. I wrote a book about my son with autism, and I feel a little emotional seeing you because I dedicate a chapter to you about false hope and feel-goodism. I dropped them off at the Atlantic, and I snuck one in through the VIP door, so you'll have it back here. And I quote you about false hope, and you've been hugely inspirational to me. If I could do for autism what you've done for race, that would be a success, to tell the truth. So now I have a tough, truthful question to ask you. If you had the chance, or would you create the chance, would you do an in-depth, probing interview of Donald Trump Would you insist on it in the way that you did that probing, comprehensive interview of Obama? And if you did, what would be the most important questions you would want to ask him or truths you'd want revealed?
That's so funny. You know, Jeff Goldberg asked me that question behind stage.
Of course he did. I gave it to him. So.
Evidently. He tried to take credit for it.
I know. It was mine.
You.
It was mine.
Yeah, of course I do the interview because I'm a journalist. At first I said no when I was like, but yeah, of course I would. What would be the most probing question? I don't know, because again, like with Obama, like there were things that I didn't like and that I disagreed with, right? But I had an assumption of sincerity. I didn't think Obama was a liar. You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't just going to like openly lie. I don't have that sincerity piece with Donald Trump. So I think like trying to figure out what the whole purpose of the interview would be like one of the more challenging things, because it's not truth. It's not truth. You clearly are not trying to get to any sort of deep truth, except in the sense that it might be accidental truth. You know what I mean? Like within, like if you get somebody who's, you know, covering, one of the things I found as a journalist, you get 4 hours with anybody, eventually they become themselves. But Donald Trump is himself. See, that's the thing. So like, what I'm not, like, what would I be digging for?
Yeah.
You know, he's remarkably candid. I don't think, like, there's not much subterfuge going on at all, actually. I don't find it hard to understand. You know, things about, you know, Obama that, like, I felt like I really had to figure out. I don't feel like it's hard to figure Trump out. So I guess I would have to think quite a bit about what would be the purpose.
Right.
You know, the thing.
Right. I'll help you.
Yeah. Digging deep in a 2-inch sandbox.
That's right, exactly. Exactly.
One more up here on the right.
Hi, thank you so much for coming tonight. Reading your essay, and again, as the epilogue, I think you're saying the diagnosis, if the diagnosis for how Trump became president is how much people in this country identify with whiteness and the backlash to a black president, what would you say is the prognosis for going forward, and what can we aim to do together that someone like Trump is never elected again?
Well, I mean, I don't know about the prognosis. Again, I would not assume that, you know, this is all going to, you know, that people are going to be so horrified this is all going to be taken care of. People forget. People forget. I remember when people were so horrified by the incompetence of, you know, the Bush administration. You know, and I can remember essays, you know, published places talking about the end of the conservative movement, and you know, and it turned out just to be completely wrong, completely, as it always does when people don't realize that something is actually representing a deep will, you know, among folks. You know, I think this will not get fixed until a critical mass of white people in this country decide that it's in their interest for it to get fixed. Every time there's some degree of progress, you know, in terms of race and racism, in terms of defeating white supremacy, there's always an interest, you know, for white people in it. Again, that's not particularly unique to white people. It tends to be true when people have power. The only way they tend to concede any, you know, even an inch of it is if it somehow, you know, redounds back to them. So the Civil War is not, you know, for instance, when the North decides to fight for union, this is not a charity case for black people. Like, it's something to really be gained out of that. You know, if they allow, you know, these southern states to secede, it could be the end of their country as they know it. So they got to fight. Why did they decide to start, you know, allowing black people to fight? Beginning of war, they don't want any part of black people fighting in the Union Army. Well, they start losing and they start running out of people, and suddenly black people are fit to fight. You know, civil rights movement. You can't understand the civil rights movement without the shadow of the Cold War. You just can't. I mean, it suddenly became inconvenient. You know, and I'm not saying that's the only thing. I just want to, you know, be really clear here. But at every moment, there's interest, you know, for folks. If you want hope, and I hate saying it like this, the one area that I see is you are beginning to see areas, specific areas of white supremacy and effects of white supremacy that are now stretching beyond the borders. I can't remember that young man's name, but he was a gentleman in a motel room, and somebody called and said they had, you know, he had a gun, and they executed him. They treated him, excuse my language, like a nigger. They just shot him. He was trying to pull his pants up, and they shot him for it. when you start, and see, like, the origins of that have everything to do with white supremacy. Why you have a police department that's like that, it feels that way, has everything to do with racism and white supremacy. When you start seeing it bleed out like that, you might see some change. Wasn't no change in that case, cop got off. You know, so they treated him like a nigga all the way through the whole process. When folks start to feel themselves threatened, you know, this is not new. Bob Moses, you know, when he was, you know, protesting, he said, listen, some of these white people are going to have to get hurt for folks to get it, for them to feel, because as long as it's just us, people ain't going to care. There's no interest here. It's sad to put it that way. But to the extent that there is any, it has to threaten more than black people. Because the fact of the matter is our history here since 1619 shows that we are expendable. And we only become unexpendable to the extent that our expendability threatens other people. I maintain that, I mean, again, if you want a little bit of hope, that actually is the case. You know, that we are trapped in this together. That, you know, and you see this in Trump, right? To act on your worst impulses is to act against your basic safety. I think that's basically true. The question is, you know, whether folks will wake up, you know, quick enough, you know, and get that figured out, or if, you know, will whiteness, you know, prove to be, will white supremacy prove to be effectively a suicide pact? I hope it's the former and not the latter.
And on that note, we have to wrap it up. We were 8 years in power is on stands now. Ta-Nehisi, thank you.